Okay, so Lessons from Settings and Programs is panel 3's charge, and I'm just here to tell you that everything's going to become very clear in the next hour. No worries. So we approached our charge with a question. How do we clarify what goes on inside programs? What are the processes, practices, and variables? Another umbrella question, and I have to say my questions keep going on and on as you all talked this morning. And this comes from Patrick talking to Valerie and regurgitated by me. How do we get PYD recognized as a meritorious science? How do we do excellent science deserving of funding? These are themes that we heard all morning. And how do the concepts and approaches get to be integrated into intervention and developmental mainstream? Okay, so briefly, we have 4 speakers who are going to hopefully give us a lot of insights into what does go on inside the youth settings that we've all been talking about. Recognizing the heterogeneity that Margaret talked about, and the multi-what question that Rich posed is always sort of on the umbrella of our thoughts about what goes on inside youth settings. So Dale is going to talk about the variability and emergent nature in YD programs and implications for improving evidence that can inform practice and policy. We're going to go in alphabetical order panel in case you didn't know that's what was in my notes, okay? Oh, there we go. Nancy is going to talk about how do we agree on a core set of constructs across programs. Again, heterogeneity. There's music, sports, civic participation. Embedded within this or overarching this are the cross-cultural and diversity issues. Reed is going to talk about what happens inside programs. I think we all are, but inside that black box, what is the complex and nuanced life of programs and the youth in them, and how do they navigate the complexities? And of course, Jean, drawing from mentoring, to discuss how evidence in PYD can be used and misused, and looking at what's most effective. And I'm just going to end my introductions with one point that I added, and that had to do with perceptions, which came out today, I think, when Margaret started talking about it. And now to show how old I am, about 31 years ago, I was measuring actual demands of kids for their temperament, looking at the Thomas and Chess goodness of fit model, thinking, the whole idea that if youth behavioral individuality is fit with the context, then they should be better adjusted, taking Thomas and Chess's conceptual ideas and actually trying to measure them. And one of my committee members said, you can't just measure what actually is going on in the context of what the parents actually want and what the peers actually want and what the teachers, you have to measure youth perceptions because they could be very different. This was Dave Palermo, the late Dave Palermo, who was on my committee at Penn State. In the psych department. So we measured it, I measured it, and it did come out to be actually more important and predictive than what actually was going on in the context. So I was saying at lunch to Doug, it just amazes me at how we're still talking about how we have to measure youth perceptions of their context, meaning making, etc. So, okay, I'm going to just be quiet now until later when I keep time with Dale.
As everyone says, it's like to be here, and
now I can't see.
Thank you. And I want to talk about somebody exploring pathways to impact, but I need to sort of set a context. I'm coming at it from a very different place than most of you, I think, in that, and I'll use Stephen's 3 aspects of youth development. So I started coming at it from a youth development as a process, and believing that with the work at Search Institute and stuff, that there were what I end up with is sort of a developmental diet and exercise analogy. So there are developmental nutrients that young people need: caring people, constructive places to be, challenging opportunities, that type of thing, and you provide these and then you get different. And in those kind of relationships and places, young people need to exercise what loosely is developmental muscles, whether it's contribution or other constructs in youth development. And that's sort of how I came at it. Then I became involved more in the second definition around a philosophy, an approach. How do we think about these developmental processes differently? And then for the last dozen years, I've been involved in how do you help youth programs of a wide variety of types, from the types of intervention programs some of you have been talking about to the 4-H and Boy Scouts and a variety of programs that are in the youth development business and not in any kind of prevention business, though they are increasingly challenged by funders to show that they should be in that business or that what they're doing has an effect on those kind of things. So that's where I'm coming from, and what I want to do then is talk about that sort of very broadly, and then get to a couple of particular points. All right. Yeah. So for me, the field of youth development is about that accumulated knowledge of various types, so multiple types of knowledge, not just the scientific types. It's about a proactive generation of new knowledge that changes the probability that kids will experience or thriving in the sense that I think you were talking about, Steve. And it's then about the way we utilize that knowledge in practice and programs and policy and in the public's understanding of development to make a difference in the lives of young people. The challenges are sort of as leaders and members how to best work to improve that impact in intentional and evidence-informed ways. That's much of the question we're talking about. And how to also then strengthen the field and position the field in light of that work and to make it a respected, valued, critical approach to the contributions of young people in multiple ways. In part, I want to just identify up front that my thesis, if you will, is that the field of youth development, not necessarily prevention science, but the larger field which I was describing earlier, has to shift from a primary accountability to proving it has impact to an emphasis on improving its impact. And it doesn't mean actually you move away from outcomes, but you move away, you change the way you think about it in some fundamental ways. I want to just take a moment to describe some languages around impact that I'm finding useful in terms of conceptually. So potential impact is impact you might infer. If a program did some things in its design, you might believe there's some potential for that program to have an impact. So if it's a mentoring program and they last more than 9 months, you might be able to say that there's some potential they'll have some impact. Inferred impact is a little stronger because you're actually measuring something about the program. You're measuring the quality of the aspects of the way they're delivering the program. So in the mentoring, you're seeing whether or not they were matching well or other aspects of quality. Measured impact is just whether or not we've actually measured it or not. It doesn't change the impact at all. It just says whether you found it or not. And then real impact, which is distinguished from all of those, is what actually the impact on a kid was. And even measured impact isn't real impact necessarily, because we may not have captured it in all the right dimensions. And I'm going to talk more about real impact because I think it's a better way to frame it. And then you do studies that actually use measured impact to make the relationships, if you will. And I'm coming at it from a programmatic perspective. So this is a hypothetical. All my data is hypothetical. One thing about not collecting data is you can always hypothesize what it was. So what I'm trying to show here is that if a kid has no programs, you can expect no positive effect from that program because he's not in anything. So not a positive or negative thing. If it's some kind of an unknown program, you don't know very much about it, it could have a positive impact. I'm showing it at some level. But it's got a wide variability. You don't know. It could be negative impact, which is goes below the line. It could be, you really don't know very much about the impact of those kinds of programs. If it's a promising program, meaning it's using some aspects of evidence to inform what it's doing, you get both more impact likely and you get a little bit less variation in that. If you can monitor some aspects of the program, in the prevention research, if you had high fidelity in these programs, you'd probably say, well, you're probably getting a little bit higher impact, and again, the variance in the impact between programs and individuals in a program is lower. And finally, if you get to a proven program, meaning there's evidence of outcomes and identification of the practices that led to those outcomes, and you're doing those practices well, you're likely to get higher impact and, again, reduced variance type of thing. And in any given community, and in many cases for any given kid, they're experiencing all different types of these things potentially, or none of them, depending on the individual. And in communities, the balance of these is very different, as I'll talk about later. So given this, how do we focus on improving the impact rather than just proving it? How do we use evidence to frame key factors and pathways that might improve impact? How do we conduct applied research that studies and connects these pathways, particularly studies that connect them to the outcomes? Many times we're doing studies, but we're not connecting the quality variables to the outcome variables in the ways in which we're doing things. And then how do we work with various groups to help them access and then improve these pathways? And access is a major issue in these kind of programs because without access to the program, you get no effect. And again, this is a context setting. Most of the programs I'm talking about are voluntary programs. They're not mandatory programs, or they're not programs which you've been assigned to participate in, which is the more typical kind of youth development program. Some would say it's a critical definition of a youth development program, is that it's voluntary. Well, as I tried to think about that for practitioners, they were stuck in and funders were stuck in largely a additive model. If you want to have more impact, add another program, or add more kids into the program. And what this tries to say in a simple way is we have to think about it more in interactive terms or multiplicative terms, that the real impact is a function of the access to the program, both the factors in the community that affect access, but also the individual factors that affect access. So almost all of these have multiple levels of measure you could think about. It's affected by the design of the program. Does the program have features that are designed into it that are likely to be useful? Does it have enough structure? The safe elements that some people talk about. The quality of the practice as actually delivered. This is the Charles Smith and the point of service. As you actually observe it happening, not just does it get designed that way, but as it's actually being practiced, are the elements of quality present? So are they engaging young people? Young people have voice, different dimensions you can think about. And then lastly is the actual individual youth engagement in it. Is this something that they are participating in irregularly or not at all very much? Or is it something that they can't wait to get to and they are in the zone when they're there? They're getting a high level of flow in the sense of some of the positive psychology kinds of things that Mike and others have talked about. Well, from that sort of, and I'm not arguing that these are exactly multiplicative effects because they're not single variables. I hope that's clear. But then if you do that, you start saying, okay, what are the pathways we might improve impact given those different factors in the equation, if you will? So the first one is we can do something, if you want to increase outcomes, you could increase access. Changing the number of people who experience programs is a fundamental way to improve impact. And yet, what do we know from, or what are we using from prevention or developmental science to change that factor? You could strengthen the designs. So a lot of the studies that are doing meta-analysis stuff are trying to figure out what are the design features that make a difference and then have programs that design those in. You could improve the quality of practice. Some of the, and I'll use mentoring again, there's now mentoring standards being talked about that are around quality and actually observing that these things are present in the program in some ways. Or you could work on enhancing the engagement. And developmentally, as young people grow and get to the adolescent years and stuff, they're making decisions about their levels of engagement independent of or interdependent with many other factors. And so how do you give them more choice because it'll make them more engaged in the program and stuff. So there are other factors. And then you could upgrade the youth workers' expertise. I'm using the word expertise rather than competency because it's not just a specific set of skills, but the knowledge about what's going on and the ability to interact in the way Reeds will show, I think, and talk about dynamically with the learning environment so that you're adjusting what you do to what's happening. But those are multiple pathways you could start to think about influencing, and then you can think about the ways in which evidence can be used in each of those pathways, and not all of those pathways necessarily require the experimental or quasi-experimental design, though all of them could also benefit from more of those kinds of things. So various factors I think I've talked about a little bit. I want to go on, I think, in terms of the thing. So then you come to how do we compare these different kind of pathways as ways of improving impact. In other words, the goal here is not improving the intervention. The goal here is improving the community's level of impact on young people's outcomes, both positive and negative outcomes. Increase in positive, decrease in negative. which paths engage and motivate the key players differently. So one of the key things, for example, is outcome studies are very demotivating to practitioners. Quality studies are very motivating to practitioners. It's something that's in their control, they can get to it. So in terms of trying to motivate, you get a different engagement process. That doesn't mean it's necessarily more effective unless you get the right things that they're engaged in. Yeah. That's important. So I'm not minimizing the need for those studies. Which paths are most cost effective given limited resources? Which paths are most feasible given existing and emerging kind of capacities are very important. And in different communities, those things will be potentially different. Which paths have the best or most feasible means of accountability? If we want to increase the accountability for doing the right things, then you have to both have evidence of the right things, and you have to have ways of helping people be accountable to those things, whether it's fidelity to a model or whatever the elements are. In which paths will stakeholders invest? So that for example, in Minnesota right now, early childhood is doing a lot of accreditation, parent-aware kind of stuff to raise visibility. The United Way was able to raise $3 million in a very short time to improve access by programs who couldn't meet the standards. So all of a sudden there was a flow of investments that wasn't there before to meet standards that were there. If we don't have standards, they don't have a place to invest in those kind of things. And where's the evidence strongest type of thing? This is a hypothetical situation. How might it make a difference in some sense? So I'm going back to that earlier diagram of those bars. And this is just making up a hypothetical community. This is a community where 20% of the kids have no programs, 30% are in some kind of unknown, 20% are in some kind of promising program, some are in monitored, and 10% are in these sort of proven programs. It's totally make-believe. I want to just stress that. But if you look at that, if you were to... Yeah. And imaginary answers are always easier to come up with. Yeah, well, I try not to be too negative. Yeah, this was the optimism in me. Well, again, you get this sort of effects, and if you use those percentages from the other diagram and these kind of average effect sizes, you'd get a calculated total for that community. So that would say that the effect that we're getting out of our programs and kids' participation program is at this level. So then you can ask, again, theoretically, what happens if you change things? So if you were to decrease the non-participation, so you increase access by 10%, what kind of an increase in effect do you get? If you were to double the amount of quality monitored programs, in other words, if you do something about quality, even if you couldn't get to more proven programs, what would happen? What happens if you double the number of proven programs? Well, it doesn't have as big an effect because there's not that many out there already. So you get an effect, and if you double the engagement because it has an effect on all these things, you get a bigger effect in some way. Again, it's a way of thinking about how do you model at a community and at a program, across program level, to do that. Because I think we're starting to get to the point where it's not only what happens in programs, but what happens in communities that affect these kind of developmental opportunities that matter increasingly. So we need to use multiple sciences, and there's a role for prevention and development, but there's also a role for other sciences in this as well, which all of us would acknowledge, I think. Two last points. One of the things as I've been working in this space, increasingly believe we have a problem in accountability because we're holding the wrong levels accountable for the wrong stuff. And so how do we start thinking about accountability for what and accountability where? And this is just a simple example of how if at a policy level we were clear about what the outcomes were and they included positive developmental outcomes, you could have more people working intentionally on improving those things. If you monitored outcomes at a geographic level, not a program or system level, so it's about how are kids in this geography doing, of which many systems interact. When we keep connecting outcomes to a system, we limit the other players' roles in that system to too great an extent. If we want effective designs and effective access, how do we do that with system level? And similarly, if we want the quality of the program, how do we do that at the program organizational level and the quality professional maybe at the association level for the professionals? Lastly, I wanted to say that I think it's important when you think about it in these terms, and as you think about the developmental science and prevention sciences, that you think about it with an awareness of a bunch of factors that we don't tend to think enough about, I think. What's the relationship between the cost of the program and the cost of the evidence? if programs are really cheap, how much money do you put into evidence to prove that they work? If you have reasonable, and you have to get reasonable evidence stuff. I'm not arguing you don't have evidence. If the cost of the problem, whether it's a risk behavior or the absence of strengths, what's the cost of that relative to the cost of the evidence? So there's a reason a lot of dollars go into medical kinds of things, and we have to think about it in those terms. The cost of monitoring and these kind of things is also a cost that programs bear in many ways. And how does that affect into how does that work in relation to the cost of the program and the cost of the evidence and things? So thinking about this in this sort of larger policy and program context, in a community context where programs are an intervention of a type, but programs are also much like families, a context in which development occurs increasingly, and how do we think about those contexts in these kind of broader ways, and then use evidence in multiple ways to improve the practice in those programs, the availability of those programs, and ultimately the impact of those programs.
Unbeknownst to me, I think we're coordinating quite well in terms of looking at real-world experiences and lessons learned from these settings. What is interesting to me is I thought for a while in my career that I had a lot of answers. And actually listening to all of you today, I think, well, you must have the answers now. Now I think I'm just trying to ask the right questions, and I think sometimes we answer stuff that aren't even maybe the right questions. And so what I'm just going to do today briefly in my 10 minutes is just kind of share with you what I think are some of the questions and hope we can articulate an agenda to move the field forward. I've been working in this field a long time. I started out as a youth service worker running programs many, many years ago, and we're kind of dealing with some of the same issues. And so hopefully, some of this will at least resonate with new ideas or what we can do. And for me, a lot of my thinking has been really colored by my more recent international experience working in developing countries and seeing a whole different level of systems and ecology, and working in countries where the politicians are the worst criminals, and how you think about ecology. Well, yeah. But I mean, where you really, literally, like Jamaica as an example, where the two parties armed their, respective supporters, and that's how, a lot of stuff started over time, and they still do. And, so there's just so many layers of it. What's a universal intervention? But anyhow, so let me kind of just share with you. Okay, what am I doing wrong?
Okay. Is it on?
Okay, there we
upside
go.
down.
Upside down, sorry. So just some of the issues that came up for me, and I really would love to get people's feedback on this, and I actually have a specific kind of set of questions I'm going to ask you, so I have to hurry up. We all talk about thriving versus surviving, but when we really go into situations where survival is really critical, what does it mean? What is thriving beyond surviving? Or how do we think about things in terms of interventions? And I have a really good friend who does a lot of global health, and she says, food and housing are important interventions. And I think we have this mindset, we're always thinking about my program that I'm going to, evaluate, and then I'm going to sell it, and then I'm going to have an enterprise that distributes it and disseminates it in the context of, and I'm not knocking that, but I'm just saying there's a lot of ongoing interventions. And so I was really happy to hear everybody talking about kind of normal practices that people do. I think also this idea of we need, and I think that Margaret might have mentioned it earlier, it would be really important, and we don't do enough of this in terms of, well, in Ciudad Juarez, who are the kids that do okay? Because I don't think I'd be one of them, honestly. I'd be a drug dealer. I really would be, because it's, you're a leader, you're out there, you see, quick, if I were 16 years old, quick rewards for it. And so what does, enable some kids to survive, and not just, and to thrive, I guess, as much as you can, so that they're not surviving because they basically just don't have food and they don't have any status or friends or anything. And then I just put violence and sex up there because one of the things I've found in a lot of places I've worked is that if you're a guy, violence, if you're a girl, sex, become really quick adaptive mechanisms, and they become really ways to have some positive outcomes. And it's really clear in Jamaica, you see it a lot. And that just brings me to this, and I mentioned a little bit before, this idea of, well, what is positive, what's adaptive? Does it look differently? Is positive youth development different in different settings? You can think, what's a positive youth in Nazi Germany? What's a positive youth in Beverly Hills? I mean, are there some commonalities? I think there are. So again, I'm just saying, what are the questions? Are there certain aspects of positive that you're resourceful, you know how to access and use resources wherever you are? And are there certain things that are really more contextually bound? For me, I think working in communities internationally where it's not so much that we develop an intervention and we test it there, people are doing a lot of good things. And I feel like as an academic sometimes we give really short shrift to people who know from the bottom up kind of what kids need. They've worked with them, they've lived with them, they develop these programs, but they don't have the benefit of a theoretical model with well-articulated NIH funding to test it. And so we say, oh, well, that doesn't work. It's just that we haven't yet looked at what are these everyday settings and what are people doing intuitively. Do we really need our set of, I'm coming with my intervention? Another thing, just as a question, is that I don't know about what you all have seen, but so much of the asset strength-based positive youth development is really just risk reframed as an asset you don't have. And I see very few programs where we actually take strengths of people and say, now we're going to use your strength to leverage it. We say, here's our 40 assets, you don't have this, we're going to build that. Or here's, whatever the competencies are, you don't have it, we're going to build it. And I know when I used to work with youth, I'd say, well, what are you good at? And I say, okay, how can we use that now to do something else? And I don't see a lot of our programs doing that. So, do we really leverage strengths? And is there some way that maybe we need to think about combinations of what people are doing in the field and some kind of manualized programs? I just think we need, my frustration in the field is, and maybe I go back to what Joe was saying or my own struggles with, I don't think we have enough precision about the outcomes that we want to see happen. And so we wind up having a lot of different evaluations of a lot of different programs using a lot of different constructs and a lot of different measures. And it's really hard to compare them. We don't have like a CVCL or something. We have my measure, your measure, this measure, that measure. And some of the reason is we don't, we can't have 40 and we need some manageable number. We need to figure out some way that we can come up with some common purpose in what we're doing and develop a measure of it that we can use in multiple settings, rather than each person doing that. And I think that another frustration, again, another question is that, so many people, like competence is a good example. I mean, how many operational definitions of competence are there? How many different ways to measure it? Sometimes we look at competence to predict competence. I mean, what is it that we're talking about? Can we have some limited number of constructs, and to what extent is it bound by context? And I remember Pat and I were at a meeting ages ago at ASU, and we remember about resilience, and we were passing notes about, well, competence, resilient in some situations is smart, pretty, and wealthy. Rich. That gives you a lot of competence, in certain contexts and maybe not in others, but we need to think about it in what does the situation call for is very different, the demands of the setting. So that's kind of an issue to me. This was I just want to share with you two examples, one that I've done and one that I'm going to do, because it's where I want to use my last 5 minutes to solicit your advice and your help. So I was asked by the World Bank to evaluate the Kingston YMCA program for at-risk youth. He was the only child that we photographed. This was in a program for kids who had dropped out of school. It was a 2-year intervention, who wasn't giving some kind of hand signal for a gang. And we didn't know about that, but of course the director was telling us that. We found out actually Usain Bolt, when he won the Olympics, was giving a hand signal for Gaza, which is the group he's with in Jamaica. So people probably didn't realize that. But anyhow, so one of the challenges, so here's this program, and the YMCA is another good example of, as Dale was talking, programs that are out there doing a lot of work. Well, how do you evaluate it? Where do you start? They're doing this, the kids are doing better, they know they're doing better, but yet they don't have a lot of evidence, they don't have any kind of measures. And so the challenge was, how do we map on some of these constructs that we're talking about? What is it that we think a program like this would promote? They come to school, they're disciplined, they have a lot of issues, and how do we think about it in terms of preventing outcomes and promoting development? And there's a long story about it, I won't go into it. Here's my problem, my issue right now, my question for you. And this is like a fabulous opportunity for the field. So if anybody wants to chime in and have some ideas that would be fabulous. So the Inter-American Development Bank is going to do a randomized controlled trial of 4,000 youth in Venezuela who are part of this National Children's Orchestra. You may have heard Gustavo Dudamel, the famous conductor, was the star pupil of the orchestra. These are for low-income kids, and they all get a chance to play in the orchestra, and they're actually going to have a randomized controlled trial with one group in a wait list and one group in the intervention for a year. And they came to me and said, well, help us come up with some individual indicators of positive youth development. They want to see, does this program have an impact on promotion, prevention? They don't really differentiate, just good things for the kids. We want to see how it works, is how they frame it. So one of the things I was hoping to get from this meeting, from you all, since you all seem to have more answers than I do, is really, well, what might they be? Can we come up with some set that I can use in this project, you can use in your project, and then at the end of the day, we can actually even compare. I mean, to me, the orchestra is a great real-world intervention, and I'll talk about why. Some of the things that we're thinking about, and just to kind of organize in some way, would be at least these categories of, some kinds of skills and beliefs relevant to positive outcomes. And Catherine and I did a thing on core competencies to try to get to this goal, and came up with some of these ideas of what is it that you need independent of the context you're in, that seems to also predict prevention. So self-regulation to me is probably at the top of a lot of people's list in terms of doing well in the world. If you live in Africa, if you live in Beverly Hills, you need to self-regulate at some level. We can't just blurt out things that we think, and et cetera, et cetera. And these were some of the things we came up with, decision making. We added this idea of resourcefulness because I don't know if it's the right term, but you need to be able to leverage resources in some way. Every setting has some kind of resources, but some people are better at finding those than others. Can we teach that? What are some of these things that you might get? And then, to me, positive youth development is not doing bad behavior. I mean, it's not being aggressive, and it's not using drugs, and et cetera, and it's being engaged. And so I don't see the distinction. I think preventing risk behaviors or preventing problem behaviors is part of positive youth development. I wouldn't be happy if my kids were aggressive and using drugs and pregnant, but yet they had a lot of good skills. I mean, that doesn't, that's part of it to me. And then this whole issue of well-being. Do we want to include life satisfaction and happiness and not being depressed and mental health? But right now, those are the kind of frames that we're using, and we're trying not to use, my model or Rich's model or asset model, but to kind of think more strategically about what might be the next generation of how we frame this. And then to try, and I'm glad that a lot of people brought this up today, what are some of the mechanisms and processes that we can sort of map onto this program, that we can probably map onto a lot of programs. We were talking about 4-H and the YMCA, and so if you think about an orchestra, it really does allow for skill development, allows for mastery being a hugely important concept for kids to learn to do something well. You start thinking, I start thinking about the orchestra, and you're just like, wow, it's like positive youth development in a nutshell. It's wait your turn, it's self-regulate, it's practice all the time, it's follow the rules, it's follow your leader, your peers help you, in terms of your music, it's regulating your behavior in the group, it's part of being part of we're the orchestra. And I think the last thing that no one's yet said today, it's fun. Kids like it. And, that's an important component of a process. I don't know about you all, but if I'm having fun doing something, I'm going to do it more. And I think sometimes adults forget about this, in lots of ways. So, okay, good, I'll be done. But, if people have ideas, we're right in the middle of doing this. Like, I've got to go to Venezuela in 2 weeks and work with them on this. So if you have ideas on ways we might frame this, ways we might use this as a pilot project, I would greatly appreciate it. Both in terms of how we can think of some processes that we might map onto other programs as well, that it's more useful beyond this. So just the kind of wrap up of this knowledge base, I think my questions are around, can we come up with common indicators? Can we come up with a common measure? Can we come up with common processes that we can use across programs? Can we think about sort of cross-cultural adaptation with really some minor changes? And so when we did the study in Jamaica, we used a lot of the standard measures, and they worked pretty well. You'd have to do a few little modifications around, like we had to modify a question on yelling because we realized that, well, everybody yells. There's a lot of loud talking. And people go, well, we don't get that. So we'd have to say scream at the top of your lungs. But it was pretty adapted, it was pretty easily adapted to the situation. I think we don't have enough. I mean, tribute to everybody around who's done work on resilience and stuff, but we just don't have enough research on what is it that kids need to do in these really desperate environments, in really corrupt contexts. And then can we use this to, if we're going to build these structured interventions, to say, here's what we want to promote, here's what we want to build, and here's how we're going to tap strengths of youth, that we're going to actually bring strengths into what we do. And that's it.
Okay, well, I already introduced my gig earlier, so I cut off my introduction. No PowerPoint. I don't have all of Nancy's answers, or probably very few of them. I'm interested in use and program leaders, active, conscious experiences and processes inside youth programs, inside naturally occurring arts, tech, leadership, or orchestra programs. And I'm not sure, I think compared to prevention, there's been much more kind of open-ended qualitative research inside the black box, and ethnographic and observational studies, in-depth interview research with youth and program leaders, a lot of studies of individual programs, sports, arts, cultural identity, youth organizing programs, youth research, and a number of really good qualitative mixed method studies of multiple programs. Bart Hirsch, Nancy Deutsch, and David Dubois just published a terrific book, award-winning book on Boys and Girls Club that shows what quality really matters, the difference between a really good Boys and Girls Club and a bad, and it shows it at every level of the organization. It's really superb. And what's important about these studies is they approach their topic open-endedly, not imposing the researchers' preconception and scrim on what they see. It's more bottom-up. It's trying to understand the processes as experienced and enacted by the people in the setting. And I like to call it grounded theory, just because it kind of reassures people doing quantitative research that, okay, this is a different category, it's just theory. So, you can bracket it that way if you want. It's a different epistemology, different standards of knowledge. And it produces, I think, more middle range knowledge, more context-based, rather than grand explanation. One thing that's immediately apparent when you observe a program is how much chaos there is. I mean, there's a lot of complex and nuanced events, shaped partly by the group of youth, partly by the skills of the program leader in constructing it, as well as just unfolding events. And a lot of it, though, is episodic. Events unfold partly following the staff's plan, and partly in ways driven by youth. So, and I should mention a lot of these studies of our low-income programs for low-income youth, Black, Latino, and white youth, including my own. So I'm going to just highlight several theoretical points suggested by this qualitative research. First about youth's developmental processes, and then about the role of leaders in facilitating these processes. So think of Nancy's orchestra. First, what the research suggests is these episodes are really a crucial mechanism, if not the critical mechanism, for a lot of learning that takes place. Youth learn through cycles of activity that conclude in some form. They learn by taking on a role, whether it's the first cello or the secretary or the treasurer, and then fulfilling that role. That cycle leads them to see themselves as more responsible and be ready to take on more things. A lot of programs for adolescents involve some kind of projects. We know from the SAFE criteria that's good. And they learn through the cycle of planning, anticipating, worrying about what's going to happen, getting feedback, and then ultimately from the end of what happens. They also learn from shorter cycles, experiencing a strong emotion, If it's a safe context, they may try out different ways of dealing with that. They then get feedback on how that strategy works or didn't work, how it upset the project or helped everybody. We're finding that youth actually learn about how to use emotions in some case. So again, cycles of learning, projects don't fit into a preventative model very easily. It's hard to define it in a youth-led project. It's kind of elusive as an intervention. But those cycles, according to the youth's accounts, and what leaders are trying to do are really kind of the key of those episodes. And it goes back to Dewey, learning through doing, Piaget, Brunner, lots of people who talk about cycles of learning. And I think part of the point is that narrative events are not just an important method of development, they're also the content of development. What we learn most and best is episodes in our life, narratives. And those narratives, when we ask kids how they learn that, they just repeat the narrative, and studies of experts across fields, senior experts in military science, they always point back to episodes. A lot of our learning takes place through episodes. Ben Kirshner had a brilliant illustration of how teens doing a youth research project learned the hard way about how their own biases on a topic influenced how they interpreted their data. You can't learn that from a textbook. You learn it much better from, really striving to reach your social justice cause and find, oh, wait a minute, these kids aren't as upset as we thought they would be. They're doing perfectly fine, thank you. It was a really interesting example. Another point is that is really clear, and Dale brought this up, is fun is really important. I guess Nancy brought this up too. Intrinsic motivation. Learning sciences show that learning is most likely to occur when young people are engaged with work they care about. Intrinsic motivation is associated actually with deeper cognitive engagement in the underlying processes and metastructure of a topic area. So whether we're talking about learning about how to do a project and the strategies involved, or learning how to handle emotional situation where there's several layers, deep engagement's likely to kind of get you deeper and learn at a deeper level. So what we're finding is adolescents and youth-led programs are discovering sophisticated skills for anticipating complex alternative scenarios, as well as how to manage the emotional dynamics and motivational dynamics. Just the last point about the youth is that peers working in groups is another part of the method, and maybe, Dale, it should be up there as part of the dynamic of what makes programs powerful. It's part of the model. Now, I've been told by several prevention researchers lately that study peers that Tom DeShawn was the latest. He's told me they've done several meta-analyses that have shown that the peer group is inherently and unredeemably a negative influence. Now, I'm probably exaggerating a little bit, but it was so strong in both cases. Am I right that that's out there? Okay, peers are bad?
No.
Good. The point is we haven't really studied their positive potential. I mean, there's research in education that shows when you're able to get kids in groups and they're all motivated together, that they use their collective memory, and they're able to learn, build off each other's experiences and critiques. They support each other's commitment through the ups and downs. There's a lot of peer dynamics in there that we definitely should be studying that make, when they occur, can be more powerful. I'm not saying that iatrogenic effects don't occur. Let me just emphasize that. That's like really, really an important finding. But they don't mean we should discount this other potential there until we've really actually given it a chance in good research. Let me shift then to the experience of skilled youth practitioners. As Nancy said, people doing this have learned a lot through years of experience, through daily trial and error. I know trial and error isn't perfect, but if you're trying to make something happen, trying to get a project to go, you learn pretty quick what not to do and what works. What we found is that leaders really have experienced leaders have a lot of expertise. When you ask them close questions, they have a whole lot of decision rules. that help them guide youth's narratives in these projects, sustain their motivation, learn from each other in positive ways. And a lot of this wisdom can't be packaged as formulas. It's not like, do this. It's like, in this situation, if this, do that. It's very nuanced, context-specific, often child-specific. It can only be studied with qualitative research, and it probably can't be tested by, it's just, there's no way you can have the precision of research to study whether a specific action is going to work or not. So it's contextual. It involves experience with a wide range of situations that arise in practice. It's strategies in context. Okay. So just to give you a sampling, we're looking at skills and skill sets of leaders in 10 different kind of fairly specific domains. So one is, and this is inspired by Jean, is how do you create trusting relations with kids? And we found that what youth really value about leaders is they're able to bridge the role of adult and friend. So how do you actually do that, though? I mean, especially with an adolescent, how do you be their friend and be an authority figure at the same time? I mean, that's not something, it's not just, okay, do it. There's a lot of tricks to that, and they're able to do it very consistently and effectively. Kate Walker, my student, did a dissertation on this. Experienced leaders also have a big toolbox of strategies for keeping youth's learning process on track in response to a whole variety of different situations. Certainly when they're doing projects, you get stuck. Kids get on some idea that could be dangerous. They have crazy ideas, but you want to redirect them without deflating their motivation, keeping ownership with them, without humiliating them. And we have a whole series of structured questions we're asking about different situations, and they really have brilliant kind of decision guidelines for when you intervene and when you don't, when you provide feedback, when you provide advice, when you support them even when you disagree. And these they also provide structures, kind of proactive structures, to provide a pathway for youth's work, keep them in the zone of proximal development, includes built-in cycles of feedback, a loosening of some of that structure as kids get more advanced. They provide a lot of coaching aimed at infusing structured forms into youth's thinking. So they're often the guide on the side. It's youth-led, but if you observe, they're sitting on the side, and they're whispering or giving a little suggestion here. And a lot of that is about kind of stretching their thinking, giving them some structured tools. We talked earlier about them not having a great sense of the future. Well, getting them to think like 2 weeks down the line, if you do this, what will happen? 3 weeks down the line, what if this happens? They're infusing some strategic kind of thinking structures into their thought process. And then kids try them out, and they learn from their own experience that these work or don't work or when they work. They're also very good at seizing upon unexpected events as opportunities for teachable moments. So their toolbox also includes skills for supporting youth's intrinsic motivation, keeping youth from getting burned out, letting them experience the right amount of frustration or boredom, to learn from them without getting so bored or frustrated that they exit, right? We want them to be, have some of that experience, but how much is the right amount? And they have good decision rules for that. There's great research in learning science, Abby Kaplan and others, that shows really how complex it is to try and support kids' motivation. I'm sure as a parent or a teacher, you know about that. There really is a lot of wisdom there in terms of how to handle different situations. Also supporting youth's constructive peer processes, helping youth develop trust with each other so they can learn from each other how to cultivate pro-social norms. And then a last thing that we haven't really got to yet, but is cultural competence. I mean, I think this is a critical issue. As Margaret said earlier, we tend to avoid the issue of culture and race, and for a lot of programs, it's right there on their laps. And a lot of program leaders ignore it. It doesn't exist. But research in the medical sciences suggests it's really a very delicate, complex skill that involves somehow balancing acknowledging difference with discrimination with providing a more universalist perspective so that the diverse youth within the program can all feel membership. So, and Erica Halverson has a really great article that shows sophisticated strategies in theater programs for youth to do developmental work on race, culture, discrimination, and identity. Okay, so I'll tie it up. So let me just start, I'll say, compared to prevention science, research on youth programs is quite ignorant, but I think in some ways it's ignorant at a more sophisticated way, a more sophisticated level. But I think there's all this qualitative research, where there's kind of, middle range theory, and there's room for a lot more middle range theory. But part of the reason too, and I thought Dale kind of implied is it's really, really hard to do good quantitative research with youth programs because, as somebody said earlier, programs are a non-system. Rich has said it's a cacophony. Kids are coming and going. The leaders come and go. It's hard to have a stable cohort. A lot of the process depends on older youth teaching younger youth, and if you're using a random design, you're breaking up the peer groups and you're not providing that. So last point, if we're thinking about positive development and practitioners' role in supporting it, I think with adolescents, what I'm seeing is there's kind of new emergent system change within youth thinking, thinking more about the future, being able to think about more abstract phenomena like emotions. Under the right conditions, youth are able to think, to be producers of their own development, to change the way they do things, to come up with their own rules. And so I think we need to study more about use processes. I don't know how to measure the outcomes, but I think those processes are really important and a good place to start. And we need to study more the expertise of program leaders, their strategies in context for hundreds of kind of common situations that arise in a program and probably even arise in prevention programs, but they're just swept under the rug because they don't talk about them. That's their job. But, there's always some kid leaving or some brouhaha. Yeah. And we don't talk about those, but those are really important sea change that things can go downhill from there, or they can, what we've seen is with good program leaders, those are the most powerful learning experiences for some kids. Is, the leader that comes in with grace and charm and acknowledges the problem, but solves it in a calm way that gives youth voice. And the kids go on to say, oh, I didn't know, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a pastor, or whatever, and I didn't know I could do it. But seeing how she does it, now I think I can do that. So.
Okay. Well, I am the last speaker of the day, and it's late afternoon, so I'm going to try to make this entertaining for you. I'll do my best and answer everything we've touched on about mentoring. I want to start with some thank yous. All of this Janice Cooper-Schmidt, who I work a lot with on the bottom left, Jean Grossman on the top right, a lot of mentoring researchers. We all met last week down at Big Brothers Big Sisters of America. You see David Dubois, and Renee Spencer, Carla Herrera, Michael Karcher, Tim Cavell, and a lot of graduate students. And I want to start by talking about evidence and really trying to understand, because I think in some ways mentoring more than many fields has been both used, propped up, and then brought down by evidence in very strange ways that are in some ways independent of the actual data that's out there. And so I want to kind of just bring some sense to it. And it all began, and I know I only have 15 minutes, but I'm going to give you a brief history of mentoring. A lot of it began in the mid-90s when PPV did that evaluation of Big Brothers Big Sisters of America and just had these profoundly exciting effects, half as likely to use drugs, half as likely to skip school, you know, all of these things. And it just like set everybody's on fire. Like we were just so excited. And then I came along and really was a downer because I was able to kind of show that, wait a minute, first of all, everybody's getting worse, you know, over time. And that we're really talking about very, very small effects. The effect size in that evaluation was 0.06. And we're talking about minute things. So they went from being skipping 0.9 days, so less than 1 day a year, to half a day a year. So, I mean, that was our big skipping school effect.
I just want to point out, Rick Little organized this.
Oh, perfect. Hi, Rick. And so you see mentoring is big up there. That was, you know, the beginning of a lot of what's going on, you know, with a lot of organizations across the country, Colin Powell, America's Promise. A lot of that was built around these positive findings and findings like that, which was great. Because mentoring was this intuitively appealing, easy to visualize thing. We've had lots of kind of, as today demonstrates, kind of messiness about findings, and all of a sudden, boom, here's something that really works. And one of the things that happened was that mentoring.org came about right around that time. Well, they had been around, but this really elevated them. And it's very important to know the founders of mentoring.org, or it's now Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, are all Wall Street kind of one percenters, is what I call them. They're all, you know, Goldman Sachs, all of those big companies in New York, and all they were talking about was the growth of mentoring. We now know it works. Let's spread it everywhere as fast as we possibly can. And we ended up just really, like, we had these minute effects, 0.06, and really very, like, one of the things that happened in that evaluation is, like, the control group, was 11% increase in drug use. The treatment group was maybe 8% increase in drug use. That's really just 3% difference. But what it was presented as 40% difference, because 7 or 8 was 40% of 11. I mean, all of it just got, like, it was nuts. And so, so we tried to really, so what happened was the field of mentoring took off in a way that was unhealthy. It was healthy in the sense that funding came our way. And it was, and kids got mentors. It was unhealthy in the sense that we kind of just took off on a track of practice without a lot of attention to the quality of the mentoring. And by about 10 years later, there was more evaluations that came down. Many of you know about the one that was done of the Department of Ed's student mentoring program. Is done through IES. Apt Associates did it. And the verdict was no effects on any outcomes. Okay. Then FISB did mentoring children of prisoners, and the verdict is there's still no verdict. Now, some people are really frustrated with this because the verdict is out, but they're not releasing it, and so I'm under some, you know, gag rule I can't talk about. But I can tell you that the evaluation itself was flawed. So what they did, for example, and don't quote me, but what they did was they only looked at relationships that lasted 9 months or longer. Everyone else wasn't even in the experimental evaluation at all. And if the relationship lasted more than a year, it counted as 2 relationships. Anyway, then the Big Brothers Big Sisters, I talked about the community-based mentoring, and then school-based mentoring came 10 years later. And that was Carla Herrera's study done of mentoring that now was migrating into school systems, so that many, many programs now had school-based mentoring. And I call it a tale of 2 studies because literally they had the same effect size, 0.06. So there was really no difference. And the other thing that's interesting is in the community, in the school-based mentoring, everybody got worse. Again, the experimental group got worse at a slower rate. They used a more stringent and I think blindly used controls for multiple comparisons. They had the same kind of pattern of effects that were all wiped out. And so the verdict was really there was only very few effects and they were gone. All except for skipping school, which we now know occurs in like less than 1 day per year. Most of the effects were gone by the 15-month follow-up. Okay, so on the basis of those two evaluations, the top one and the bottom one, and the middle one, a lot of funding for mentoring got cut. So they were getting $100 million. $50 million was going into school-based mentoring. $50 million a year was going into the children of prisoners. It all is gone now. Okay, and a lot of it was because the evidence was now being misused. Because mentoring is not like that. It's not all, thumbs up or thumbs down. There's just a lot more nuance, and as we've been talking about today. And so what happened, let me just see if I can follow along. So recently, and we've been talking about it a little bit today, and I gave you the paper, but for those of you who haven't read it, we did David really led this effort, a meta-analysis of youth mentoring, where we looked at 73 independent evaluations, basically everything from 1999 to present. And we were we tried to be really inclusive of everything we could find. The overall effect size was 0.21. Now that was not within the margin of error, no different from the meta-analysis he had done a decade earlier, okay? And that was that took all the wind out of my sails, because I had spent that 10 years really trying to work with a team of people across the country, many of whom you saw in the first picture, and the effect size wasn't coming up very much. And then the follow-up was even smaller. Now that's not bad. It compares favorably to some of the other kinds of interventions we've been talking about, a lot of out-of-school time interventions. And what you see is we had similar effects, relatively similar effects across all of these different outcomes, and that those compared to other meta-analyses. And I have Nadia Silverthorne to thank for this table. It took a lot of work to kind of find all this. And let me just tell you the effect that this had on the field from the practitioner's point of view of this meta-analysis. It was like we said this, okay? The meta-analysis was so complicated and really inscrutable to many practitioners that they just threw their hands up. It's like, wait a minute, all the things we're doing that you say are evidence-based are not changing the game at all, and now the department, and this was right on the heels of the Department of Ed's and the Big Brothers Big Sisters school-based. Dale's shaking his head because his wife is in the field. It was like, what can we do? Because we're trying, and we're trying to improve it. And what was happening was something that I've seen as a clinical psychologist, and that's the dodo bird verdict. Does anybody know about the dodo bird verdict? In clinical psych, there's this kind of raging debate that really everything's the same. You can do psychodynamic, you can do cognitive behavioral, you can do whatever you want because it's all the same. And really what matters is just having a relationship. And so don't worry about any particular. And then there's people who are saying, no, there's certain things you can do that really improve practice. For example, we know that cognitive behavioral treatment really helps with panic disorders. But what's happened is a lot of the evaluations, the meta-analyses, have made it really impossible to discern what works and what doesn't work, because we all know meta-analyses are subject to bias in the studies that we select to go into it, in all of the ways in which we measure, as Nancy was talking about, outcomes vary. How do you even measure what happens in psychotherapy? Same thing with mentoring. But what it leaves the practitioners thinking is that nothing matters, that let's just do whatever we can to build a good relationship. And so I want you to read the first sentence of that. You don't need special skills to be a mentor. This is after years of saying, here's what you need to be a mentor. And this is brand new. And so I think we're at that point where we need to say, no, there are things you can do to make mentoring better. And I think that other fields can learn from kind of the mishaps of the field of mentoring, where we kind of lunge at findings that we are not presenting correctly. We over control for type 2 error the next time around, and we erase all the effects, and we're just kind of, I think in some ways when Dale said we need to be focusing on improving, not just proving, because proving is proving to be elusive in this field. There is no way to prove mentoring decisively because there's so many different metrics, so many different designs. If you've got a small study, you can't even measure it, and most of the best studies are these kind of boutique programs like the one that Joanna described this morning. Those probably have great effects, but we can't measure those and so forth. And so the field has taken off, and practice has gone off. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, because there's a lot of practice wisdom there. But us researchers, we're stuck in NIH study sections. We're stuck trying to get our papers peer-reviewed. And practitioners are like, you know what, I give up. I'm just going to do what I think is right and what I think works. And
5 minutes.
Oh, and consequently, we have, this is just to give you an idea of where we're failing. Relationships in community-based programs are supposed to last at least 12 months, only fewer than half are lasting that long. Relationships in school-based mentoring are supposed to last about, at least 9 months, the school year, and you can see that they're failing to do that as well. So even if we don't have the data, we do know that there's no fidelity. There's low fidelity as opposed to high fidelity in mentoring. So now I'm going to move really quickly. I bring up psychotherapy because there are close to the same number of kids in these assigned mentoring relationships as there are in child psychotherapy. Think of the volumes of research, the conferences around pediatric psychotherapy, and there's only a few real people that are really studying mentoring and how it works. And we need to give psychology away through mentoring because we also know the paraprofessionals can be as good as, if not better than psychotherapists if we're trained them right. And that's, going all the way back to Joe Durlac's work and then more recent work, paraprofessionals could do great. So if we use that clinical metaphor, we also know that we have improved the effect size of psychotherapy dramatically. When we used to do bloodletting and lobotomies to doing cognitive behavioral therapy, we can do that with mentoring. And I'm going to very quickly tell you that this is a David Dubois' chart, but he shows that within the 73 mentoring evaluations, there was a lot of variation. So what we really need to be looking at are the ones that are getting these larger effects, and what are they doing right, and bring up the effect size of mentoring. And so first way to do that is to look at what moderates the effectiveness of mentoring. And I highlight the bottom one because I find it just fascinating. Programs that match youth based on shared interest get double the effect size, okay? I mean, that alone should be enough, okay, to tell us, Diane, that alone would be enough. But there's other things. Mentors who are trained, mentors who take on an advocacy role, all of that. And so what I'm trying to do in the second half of my career is really raise that effect size. That's what my eye is on that. And so one of the things that shared interest thing, when people, and this is, a lot of people have talked about this, Reed most recently, when kids can connect with adults around their interests and let that be the basis of the relationship and let that blossom, we're not just talking about improving positive youth development, we're talking about improving the whole quality of life. Because really what makes for a happy life, without being too philosophical, is being good at what you're interested in. And a lot of kids don't have somebody to show them what they might be interested in. And volunteers could do that. And we should be thinking about how to improve that. We can't give up on evidence-based. We can't give up on evidence-based practice. And what we have to do is take that and put it into training. And so one of the things that I've done with Janice Cooper-Schmidt, who I highlighted, is try to distill what do we know about mentoring, and we put it into something called the Elements of Effective Practice. And anyone in mentoring knows this brochure. It's downloaded, 2 million copies a month it's downloaded. And that just makes me so happy because it is giving psychology away. But right now it's just bullet points. And so the second half of my career is really going to say, all right, we know that there has to be these things in place. How do you get there? How do you screen for the right mentors? How do you train them correctly? How do you match them? And matching has become a real fixation of mine, given that finding. And so I'm going to have to skip over some great findings, sorry. But you can ask me. I realize there's a little bit of a loophole because you can ask me about those findings later. And so what Janice and I have done is developed. We've taken the elements of effective practice and we've broken it down to, well, how do you get there? And we've developed web-based training that also has an in-person component. And Big Brothers Big Sisters of America has now branded this as their training. And we're going to roll it out in 10 agencies and then hopefully across the country. So that's how you get evidence into practice, is by doing that. And we hope to move beyond even just... And the idea is to take that research, put it into things like the training of Big Brothers Big Sisters, like other mechanisms, get it out into the field, and then study that, capture that data, and improve the practice. Again, it becomes this great loop. And I'll just stop there.
What I didn't see in your lovely set of factors are family and parenting support and the protection role that Margaret and others have talked about so eloquently. You were talking about individual things.
We're just talking about the youth, like what would a positively developed youth look like?
Okay.
Not all the supports and context or anything how they get there, which is another level of it, but just what do we want to accomplish in our kids, kind of thing.
It just seemed like with the orchestra, if I think about how do these things fail, is that the parents don't care. And so pretty soon the kid says, well.
Well, those might be good moderators, and they might actually be other outcomes that maybe it has a positive experience that the parent sees their child doing something well.
Yeah. Okay.
That would be another level of very important.
Yeah, great.
Rich, you're next.
Oh, okay. So, Nancy, I think you talked about the need for more work on self-regulation, and so I just wanted to tell you about a project that we're doing where we've taken the research on the 4-H study, specifically about intentional self-regulation. We use a model of intentional self-regulation that comes from Paul Baltus's and Alexander Freund's work. It's called the SOC model, Selection, Optimization, Compensation. And through a grant from the Thrive Foundation for Youth, we've translated this work into tools that can be used by mentors, excuse the expression.
She loves that.
I know, I'm teasing. It can be used by mentors to promote self-regulatory skills in their kids and link it to both PYD and youth contribution. And the tools include rubrics that the mentors could use, a mentor guidebook for exercises in promoting intentional self-regulatory skills, and then we had professionally prepared several videos in which we have young adults who have gone through several of the life challenges that many of the kids that we are studying.
Probably
It's not me.
Sorry, just ignore
Okay.
it.
Should I answer it? It could be for me. No? Okay.
It's an experiment.
The answer we've been looking for.
The ringer up.
So we have these videos. So let's say you're a Latino who is interested in the arts, or an African American kid who is trying to garner scholarship money to go to the college of their choice. We have these vignettes with actual kids that we've recruited that show how they've used their self-regulatory skills to actually move forward positively in life. We're currently doing a large nationwide evaluation of this, so stay tuned. But those tools will be made available to everyone who wants to use them. So.
Well, I think, can I just say one thing back to that? Because it's very interesting that if you think about something like self-regulation, you learn it every day, all the time, and so to the extent that we could help parents even figure out how to do small things that teach self-regulation, but I think we need to come up with what are those things that we want to, I just said self-regulation because that seems to be across disciplines like, a leading candidate. But there could be others, and then we could come up with these tools for how do you do it in daily life rather than an intervention. How do teachers do it? That's fantastic.
They're tools for everyday life.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if we can come up with a set of here's what we want kids to learn, how we're going to do that in daily life and not just in our intervention. So I'd love to see it.
Okay.
Pat is next on the list.
Is there a way we can get Nancy, one of Nancy's slides back up? There's a slide where you say, here's the processes that go on for kids and being in
Do
an
not
orchestra.
ask me about that.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to delay things too long, but I wanted to get it up there because I think as we try to get hold of what are these things doing that we think are good and helpful, I was in these talks starting to try to understand. One of my questions I realized in this is what's special about these things? So what's special about mentoring compared to getting up in the morning and staying alive and experiencing life? And how's that different? And how's this orchestra, for example, different from what kids might have learned in Nancy's other scenario of whether or not they should become a drug dealer or get a bus? Because in both of those, you're having interactions with adults, you're learning about things, you're certainly learning self-control. I think there's probably few professions that are
have stronger feedback if you don't have good self-control than drug dealing. You wind up getting hurt pretty seriously. So I just wanted to try and say, if we're going to try to get to, I hope we get to the slide before I get done my comments. Okay. So just this here, and I'll make one other side comment and I'll go back. There was a movie Ingmar Bergman made towards the end of his career. It was about an orchestra. I don't know if anybody ever saw it, but it's about all the things that go on in an orchestra before they come out and perform. And it's just a big soap opera is what the movie is. But it's hilarious as well as really disturbing and funny. And it's about how people in this orchestra are not experiencing this as a wonderful artistic expression. They're experiencing it in all the myriad ways people experience life. And I just thought about, as somebody who had my band teacher challenged, I could argue that this isn't really what being in an orchestra does. This is what people who are really good get out of being in an orchestra. Whereas all those kids who aren't so good may not get this. And so my thought was, and this is why I want to see the slide, is maybe what we should be doing is taking something like that. That's a theory about what the orchestra does for these kids, and see whether or not that actually happens. And if you can, and this is where prevention science has helped us some, if it's more than just a really oblique selection factor. In other words, kids who do well in orchestra are kids who know how to use resources, or they happen to be kids for whom orchestra is a great thing. And so it's not orchestra, it's either a fit or individual. And I think the reason I want to stop and focus, I think if we're going to get somewhere, we got to start to do that kind of thing. Otherwise, we're just we'll do orchestra, no, we'll play soccer, no, we'll do this. And we'll find good kids, we'll like them, we'll find plenty of testimony that's very effective. Well, just won't know any difference if we should keep doing it.
We thought about skill as a moderator because these are kids who don't play instruments and they all come and so do all the other kind of ways in which an orchestra impacts. You really depend on if you get good at it and you have mastery, or other candidates that may, like you say, it may not be a good experience for anybody. But what would be the moderator candidate?
Do you see these differences occurring in these kids because of this?
Yeah, you could get more hostile and angry if you're just bad at your instrument. Everybody says you suck, and they're mean to you, and But it's interesting to think about what the processes might be.
Yeah, and I think, just going back to kids learn self-direction, self-regulation in daily life, they may or may not. An orchestra where there's a lot of competition, everybody's competing, you may even be able to climb the ladder, but by,
backstabbing.
And drugs are another example of where people get pulled into drugs at the same time, rather than learn self-regulation, because the immediate rewards are stronger than the long-term negative effects. So I think what's nice about programs, a good program where you have a responsive leader and a safe, trusting environment, is that it provides the safety for kids to reflect and recognize and kind of do science in a sense of what happened, to observe what happened, to reflect back on it. So.
And I just want to add that we have been bringing up mentoring a lot, and so I think in some ways those kinds of programs are different from orchestra in the sense that they are relational. The focal is the relationship. It's not just a byproduct. And in those kinds of programs, what we consistently see as the mediator is improved relationships with parents and teachers. And so it's almost like the way therapy works. You don't go to therapy to make a friend. You go to therapy so you get along better with the people closest to you. And that then enables the kid to then go deeper into their skills and other things because their relationships are back in order.
Dale, did you have something to add?
Yeah, the self-selection point that was being made, I think it's a very important one, but it's also a point for why you do youth development opportunities in a community. The issue is youth development programs operate on the principle that they're youth-centric, that you start with the youth interests. And so the issue is not putting them into a treatment that might make their, meet their interests, or doing matching on their interests so that you increase the effect. That's a consequence. But actually putting an array out there so that they can have these experiences and be in these kind of learning cycles that you're talking about with something they care about and a person who can help guide it. Now, you can do that in intervention programs, but the logic of a youth program more broadly is that you you create those opportunities so broadly so that the kid doesn't have to find an orchestra if he's not interested in orchestra to do that for them, but they find something else that they are interested in, and they have the same kind of youth leader with the same kind of practitioner informed by both practical wisdom and evidence-based approaches.
Dan Hoffer's program, for instance.
John, you were next. I have a list, so don't worry.
First, it's right from just echo Dale's point. Self-selection is a good thing, so we should embrace that because that's where you get your big syntax. So that's number one. And then I think also reflected on this list, which is very similar, I think, to what you'd find from what National Academy's report from 2002. The famous blue practitioners called the Blue Book. Very similar set of components. My question is whether or not can we get away from just being program centric? And I recognize we're all talking about programs, so I don't need to sort of throw a wrench in that. But programs are essential, so let me say that as well. But do we need all those different pieces within a single program? So a child, you could argue, needs all those things. But a child doesn't grow up in a program. They grow up in their life. And so is the goal to get a single program to have all these things, or is it to ensure that within a child's life they're experiencing all these things? And it's a different conversation.
Different nutrients from different cereals. Yeah.
I think part of the idea though is to work backwards because there's so many there's so many interventions, programs, whatever you want to call them, out there that we think about what our theory says and how we do it rather than what they're doing and how our theory maps onto it. And it may, this was just a random list. It's not a finished product. It was just for kind of food for conversation of. And it had actually nothing to do with music, because music in and of itself has impact on brain and literacy and numeracy, et cetera, which is another whole layer. But, I think we need to get people thinking about what do kids experience in daily life. And, remember a long time ago there was all this kind of radical schooling literature about what do you really learn in school, which is to, be quiet, delay, do something that's totally boring to get a reward later on. And, but we learn things all across different contexts, and I think we need to systematize a little bit more what that is so we can study it in a way that we can communicate with each other if possible. That's just my question for you. Like I said, I don't know the answer. I just think it's a question.
So what about cultural skills?
Well,
abilities to understand people from other groups. How do we measure that?
And how many of these youth groups are diverse is another.
Right.
A limiting factor for that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, and I think just in an orchestra, the real issue to me is if you think about it, the winds go, then everyone has their piece and their role, and so this was working backwards from in an orchestra, you're not really learning about cultural diversity or how to navigate different cultural groups, although you may as a sidebar, when you don't get along with someone. I don't know how much has to be actually kind of overt, and that's another issue for the youth development. There's a lot of stuff that kids are learning that we don't know anything about, and maybe we should try to formalize it and not make it so covert, but really understand what they're really learning. Because I think that was earlier on, someone said, what is it that youth get from these things? We often don't know, and I'll never forget, I'll just tell you this one story because I love the story approach. Remember those commercials on This Is Your Brain on Drugs, and there was a girl, I watched it with my son, who was like 16, she's hitting the frying pan, she's going all over, and I'm thinking, kids are learning that drugs are really bad, and I said to my son, so what did you get from that? And he looks at me and goes, Mom, she's hot, can you fix me up with her with all your violence prevention stuff? And I'm thinking, that was it, she's hot. So what are kids learning may not be what we think they're learning, which is, I know a lot of people made reference to the, trying to go in the qualitative goes, if you don't ask something, and I know you mentioned it too, Dale, we don't ask things, we don't know, we found out in one of our randomized controls trial that we didn't have any impact on the elementary school kids, and when we did qualitative follow-up, we found out, but it worked great with the teenagers who weren't target children in our study. So we don't know everything to ask either.
Right. Catherine, you're next.
Yeah, I had a question for Jean. I thought your presentation was fantastic around mentoring, and this is a big challenge because we identify what we think is an evidence-based practice, and then it just kind of starts spreading, and then upon further review, maybe it's not as strong. And so I kind of have twofold question. One is, how do communities kind of respond when you come in with this, hey, this is a way you can tweak the program? Because we're doing some of that work at the high school level. We'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow. But we're finding that a lot of high schools are doing some kind of mentoring program. Yeah. And so we try to go in and say, well, let's move them towards an evidence-based model. We're using Sandy Christensen's Check and Connect model. But, you know, trying to get them to move and migrate away from some of the bad things they were doing, which might be, sorry, Reed, but a peer-to-peer kind of mentoring type of model that might lead to some of the iatrogenic effects. But so one is a piece around that. And the second is any potential parallels with what's going on in the social emotional learning literature now, where we have some research coming out that's from IES saying that there are no significant impacts of social emotional learning, but then there's a child development paper by Joe Durlak and Roger Weisberg that are saying, yeah, but there are. So, you know, how do we marry these kind of inconsistent findings, and what does that mean for our partners that are really trying to implement these programs? How do we try to communicate things to them?
Right. Well, I mean, I think one of the things is to be very clear that there's a lot of practice wisdom out there that we can learn from, and we're testing. So a lot of what we've discovered is based on things that programs have been doing. And so in some ways they've come up with the innovations, and we're just telling them which ones of their innovations work. And that approach worked really well with Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, who's kind of taking a top-down approach, and I thought, oh, these poor 10 programs that have to pilot our evidence-based training, there's been a big tension because they all want it. There's a real eagerness for evidence out there. The word evidence is kind of slippery too. I see a lot of practitioners using the word evidence-based, and I don't even know what they mean by it. And so also just kind of educating around what does evidence mean and where to,
It may not, anecdotal.
Right. And then the other thing I want to say about this is that Big Brothers Big Sisters, I decided I really wanted to study matching. And I noticed that Big Brothers Big Sisters of America and most mentoring programs are very random in how they match kids. It's like, who's available, they'll just throw people together, or they'll do one metric, geographical proximity, and nothing else.
We need the match.com metric.
Exactly. And so then I teamed up with these game theorists at Harvard Business School who are matching experts, and they said we can't use any of the data that's out there because it's already biased by people making matches. They have their theories. We need to randomly match all kids and mentors. All right. And so I said, oh, well, they'll never go for that. So I go to the Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, and I said, can we randomly match all your 1,000 of your pairs? And they're like, sure. And so in some ways, programs give us the ability to study things we could never study in families or schools,
right?
Because exactly, or even romantic relationships that may give us universal things. So it's really an opportunity in some ways. And what I have found throughout my career is that there's a real thirst for it.
Did it improve outcomes?
Well, no, I'm in the middle of it.
Oh, perfect. Random match.
Random matching.
Yeah.
Because we're going to look at, is there a tipping point for miles apart from each other? What about race? What about gender? What about interest? How granular does that interest have to be?
Great idea. Steve, you're not...
Social emotional learning. This is kind of more generally for others.
You have to put your name tag up again.
No, she can say
You didn't finish my question.
No comments on the
that's the whole problem on what is evidence, as you were mentioning. And I mean, I like that the chocolate diet worked, so I took that as good evidence when I started eating chocolate. But I think people are so confused because you get one side that says this, one side that says that. You get, what I always wonder is how can we have 5 lists of evidence-based practice and the program's on 3 and not on 2? And how do we help people understand that? Or what happens, I know in the state of Connecticut, they did MST for 5 years and $10 million, and they actually gathered data on outcomes, and it had worse recidivism rates than their family therapy as usual, and they're frantically, what do we do? And so there's so many issues just around that's almost a topic for another panel.
Have they published that result?
No, they were afraid to even let their...
about how it's the best thing in the world.
They were afraid to let their board of supervisors know. They're like, shoot, what do we do? They'll, cut all our funding.
There's a very negative
evidence. It doesn't always have to confirm. Finding out that something doesn't work is just as important as finding out that something does, and that's weird.
I totally agree. Try to get it published and try to go against people who have a vested interest in my program works and don't evaluate it. And then that's a big, look at DARE, look at all these. So there's a whole set of issues around evidence-based.
I wanted to comment partly on the evidence issue and what Jean was saying about the history of mentoring and stuff. I mean, another phase of that, before you started talking about it, was that mentoring was out there and going, people were pushing to grow it without any evidence, and it was starting to go down, and then the evidence came in and was latched onto, overly latched onto in exactly the ways you're talking about. So there's this cycle. But the second point is, don't underestimate the importance of the time it takes and the process of getting evidence to be thought about in practice. Because it's going to be thought about in unsophisticated ways until we have better evidence that can help it be used in more sophisticated ways. But getting them to think about evidence is something they ought to be thinking about is a really important step. So even while the mentoring stuff got all the uses and things like that you're talking about, it did get people thirsty for thinking about how do I do it better. Yeah. And then when you got to the point of here's the elements of effective practice, they're now ready to use it in a different way than they were before. So you've got this sort of up and down that you're going to experience with practitioners who are going to look for any evidence, and they're going to use their own evidence. They're going to use wildly different criteria, and they're going to take anything you say and make it 5 times more important than what you said it was. That's okay. and the evidence is much stronger, and exactly, all these things.
It's really just
8%.
Yeah.
Steve,
you also had a very good example, I thought, of the little bars. It's, let's look at the programs with the strongest effect.
Yeah. And let's look
at what comes out of meta-analyses. It's not just the average effect, because they're not all the same.
Right.
Even though we lump them into one category.
Steve, you're next.
Let me start with the evidence. So I was a history major and got introduced, and with minors in English and philosophy. So I got introduced to social science as a doctoral student, and I thought it was fantastic. You can actually generate your own evidence in history. That's cheating.
Right.
Historians have to take their evidence where they can find it. They're limited to that. And
no trials in history, right?
Right, exactly. As a result of that, when my colleagues, have gotten into debates about whether psychologists or sociologists, I'm looking at both of them and saying, well, those are just different ways of trying to figure things out. And so the notion of what is evidence, for me, is very expansive, and it turns out it's also for practitioners. When people have asked practitioners, what do you mean by evidence? And they mean things like experience and what my colleague over there did and told me about, and what they might be told exists in a scientific journal is only one dimension of that. So that's one point. The W.T. Grant Foundation has been working on use of evidence in the past couple of years, and their website introduced me to the work of Nutley, Hugh Davies, yes, in Great Britain on research utilization. And basically what they have to say is the way you guys have been thinking about how research gets used is really simple-minded, and you're going to have to get more sophisticated if you want to either understand or do anything about it. Specifically, the idea that research is used by researchers telling practitioners, policymakers, what have you, I have discovered this truth, and then they go off and act on the truth that we have discovered.
You showed them. Right?
It doesn't happen. Sorry. So there are different ways, and they rely on some work Carol Weiss did many years earlier, and bring it back, I think, usefully. And at least the way I read them, they come out saying the best way to think about research utilization is really in the context of program excellence. So the goal is doing things, program practice policy, doing things better, and research is one of the things that can achieve that. It's not the end, it's not the sole thing, but it's one of the things. And the way to do that is not only to have better research, so that's clearly part of it, but to engage the people who are responsible in generating data, analyzing data, understanding the research, debating with the researchers who have their truths to share. So it's a much more interactive process, and it is long-term. It means that it's not simply a matter of saying, I found this, now go and do better. So I'm thinking about them in the context of how we might actually make good progress in resolving some of the issues that we've done such a good job of identifying or talking about. So one way we could do that would be, instead of theorizing or debating among ourselves, would be to ask, how does this work? How do we use these conceptions? How do we infuse an understanding of the developmental processes, or understand better the developmental processes in resolving the kinds of program issues that this panel has brought to us? I mean, they're telling us these are things that are happening in the real world. Can we use those kinds of challenges as a context, a test bed in which to work out the differences that we have in our approaches? That is a genuine question. A tangentious one, because I think the answer is yes, but everybody might not, and I don't necessarily know how to do that.
Radio silence.
Yes.
Okay, yes, okay.
But I think you need to be willing to accept different standards of evidence. I mean, in terms of how you leader handles a given situation, there's no way you're going to be able to evaluate that.
Well, excuse me, but I think I'm suggesting that we shift from thinking of programs as objects to be evaluated to thinking of them as opportunities to refine and improve our own methods and theories.
Yes.
It's got to have a double header.
He implicated WT.
Oh, he implicated you.
Yeah.
Okay, then
I understand. No, I know. It's both ways.
follow up by Ed and then
just
Joe.
a plug
and
seat,
Suzanne.
said for WTG, whatever we're called. In the sense that has become the second research priority after social settings in the last couple of years, and we now have a cohort of about 15 grantees, although our focus is actually on the use of research evidence, and it came out of this whole idea of all these manualized training programs, whether it's David Old's or anybody else's, work, and then when other people go to do them, they don't fly in Peoria. And that's consistent in huge amounts of evidence. And so what we became concerned is trying to understand, really picking up on Carol Weiss and Nutley and Davies' traditions, trying to understand how practitioners and policymakers acquire, use, and interpret evidence. And it's sort of trying to the problem, the board didn't want to go with it because it's trying to regenerate a research field that's interdisciplinary. It was kind of difficult. I'm actually surprised by the number of the grantees we have on that. The kind of evidence that's, the couple studies that are far along are actually pointing a lot to social network kinds of stuff. So Patty Chamberlain's stuff in implementing it in Southern California and I think Ohio now. Larry Palinkas, as an anthropologist, has been working with it and really finds that it's the people in some county go ask somebody who they trust in another counties, who they trust for his or her interpretation of the research. And this is also coming out in some work in education as well, in district policy. So it seems to be an interesting kind of phenomenon. But the whole idea is trying to understand, what they think about research, how they use it, how they make use of it, and not sort of the push-out model that say we're going to push it out to everybody, because that really, hasn't worked. Sorry.
Okay, well, we have Joe, Suzanne, Margaret, and Pat to ask questions, and I was just told we have 6 minutes. But we started late.
Who's new? Who's new to this?
Joe.
Correct. Yeah. So the time we go over.
Okay. Well, we can take. Okay, Joe. Let's get at least the next 4 up here.
Try to be quick on this.
I want to highlight a distinction that I think is important and something that all of y'all do, which is that there's a difference between enhancing and taking advantage of and understanding naturally occurring settings and trying to create new settings. And there's a degree of messiness that comes with working with orchestras and youth groups and mentoring. But to follow up Ed's point, you also have an advantage, which is if you're working with mentoring and you're finding your 0.06 effect size from what naturally occurs, that's different than starting with a 0.3 effect size in a hothouse program that you then hope generalizes to more than 0 somewhere else. The other thing with naturally occurring programs is that in terms of resources, you've got human resources which are being generated by those programs. That mentoring exists and survives and grows in part because the mentor and the mentee get something out of it. And my advisor in graduate school was Seymour Saracen, who was fond of saying that if we define a problem as requiring more economic resources, we've defined it as insoluble. That because every problem would do well with that, that we have to think about how do we generate more human resources. And so the mentoring kind of begins to do that. And a lot of these other programs begin to do that. And my pitch would just be, as we think about this, not to say that this is the only approach, because I think sometimes straight interventions really have unique value and unique contributions, but you've got a real advantage in that you can produce something with self-generated resources. And that in a world of constrained and limited resources, that's something kind of precious that I think we don't want to lose sight of.
Suzanne?
Well, I work with a 4-H Youth Development Organization at the Department of Agriculture, and my agency has asked me to come up with a set of common outcomes for youth. And so working with our 4-H partners to try to do this, and one of the questions I had, I think probably for Nancy, is one state 4-H program leader commented to me that this is not with 4-H, but another USDA-funded program, that they've actually had to exclude a population of people from being served by this program because the outcomes that were being asked to be measured were not culturally relevant for that population. And so I guess while I'm really interested in common outcomes and support them, I guess I just wanted to pose to you that risk that you have the outcomes driving what happens in the program and who you're serving in the program.
What were the outcomes they had?
These were specifically about eating behaviors. It's a nutrition program for low-income populations, and they had a group of refugees that they wanted to serve, and none of the foods were eaten by the population that they wanted to serve. They were very culturally specific types of outcomes, and they were not relevant for this refugee population.
I think that's another big challenge for a whole other panel Pat has to convene here too, because that cuts across assessment and interventions. I mean, at some level you can't do a million different kind of interventions for every nuanced cultural variant. But on the other hand, there's some commonalities that seem to fly anywhere you go, and I don't think we've done enough. I mean, we've kind of adapted and we've tweaked it, and we've done some surface structure and trying to match with more deep structure. But, it's a real challenge because it gets back to the sort of universalistic versus relativistic. I think in development there are some universals that we can at least identify, and we need to, and then maybe some things that are more relativistic and say that it doesn't apply. But, that's, again, we get, life is a thousand-way interaction, and we get interventions as, every iteration and every kind of assessment. And I think, to me, something like, I just pick self-regulation as an example. I mean, it manifests itself maybe in different ways, but I think you can tap into something like that in all cultures. Yep. You have to wait your turn at some level. It may look different. And so my challenge and my question is, what are some of the other ones that we can say are not so culturally, contextually dependent? Now, I thought decision-making was a little more independent, and working with the World Bank on this, they're doing this 14-country study of predictors of labor market outcomes, and so we lobbied for decision making. They tried to do it in Sri Lanka, and all the women were said, we don't get it, we don't make decisions. So even that, I thought, geez, but I think that's a challenge. Are there some less contextually dependent kinds of outcomes that we can look at?
Jean has a comment, then Margaret, and Pat gets the last word.
All right, I'll be really quick, but I actually wanted to comment to something Joe had raised, and that is, kind of building on natural resources. And a new way in which people are starting to do mentoring is something called youth-initiated mentoring. And the National Guard Youth Challenge Program is the largest example of this. But rather than give a kid a fish, you teach them how to fish. You teach them to find somebody in their own network who they may not have granted the permission or feel nervous about approaching, and tell them it's a stipulation for being involved in any program is you have to find somebody who's going to support you through this. And we've been studying it for about 4 years. And here's one thing we find, that if the kid picks their own mentor versus the ones who don't have anybody, those relationships are much more enduring because they're part of the social network. But what's also interesting is now we've been following them out 38 months. Only the kids who have mentors still are maintaining any program effects, okay? So we might need to think about mentoring, because I don't know any other evaluations that have gone that many years out, as a vitamin, not as a one-shot inoculation, because when that mentor leaves, the effects leave. And so that's another pitch for building on these natural relationships.
Margaret?
I was just going to say, he said quite a while ago, but some of Steve's points. I just don't want us to get away from the importance of thinking about what we're doing in terms of these opportunities. As opportunities, as in essence experiences that guarantee healthy human development for all youth. And so how you do that, it really will require just sort of some collaborations between informants of that community, because even though people frame things differently, they want the same thing. I mean, I was sitting here just thinking in terms of, for example, the orchestra. This is good panels. They're all great panels. It's another opportunity. It's another safe opportunity. So in that case, it's not sort of generated from within. It was available and viewed as a safe place to engage in adolescent activities and to engage in, therefore, in healthy human development under these established safe conditions. And I just think that there's this cultural issue in terms of, communities view things in particular ways, and we have to go there. And that's why I meant in the beginning, is what Celia Fisher means in terms of an ethical way of doing work, that we have to use community as informants in terms of what they want for their kids. It takes a little bit longer, but it's absolutely critical that we do that in order to make sure that everyone is really on board and embracing and supporting, even though we may call it different things. For example, in terms of just, we use self-regulation a lot as a term, as an opportunity, for young people. It is really critical. Well, it's really critical because just to get to an activity like an orchestra, kids have to learn to navigate space and deal with challenges in adaptive ways and self-regulate so that they don't have undue contact with criminal justice in that process. So lives are about self-regulation or how you cope with things, and I think these activities are ways that they happen. But I think you have to consult with community people, because without that, we're imposing from the outside with our own language, with our own labels, which we may not get support from the community on, because they don't understand what we're talking about, making decisions about other people's children, and we're not talking enough, we haven't discussed that enough. And that really is bothersome, because you have some organizations, and I was thinking about in Philadelphia historically, they have an all-city orchestra, but they've also had an all-city choir. And the idea is the very same thing. You have opportunities to interact with kids coming from different schools and different places. Some kids can sing, some cannot. And dealing with the challenges of that. Those are all important experiences for adolescents in terms of how you learn to cope. And I just don't hear enough of that. I mean, this is really a wonderful opportunity. But I think there are many others that, we really have to be informed by people that we don't usually provide voice for making decisions.
Yeah, can I just add it? As we've been working with different groups and stakeholders and parents, I've been particularly encouraging us to move away from a language of programs to a language of opportunities. It appeals to young people. It changes the nature. It's the places they get opportunities to have experiences authentically. But we've also moved to learning opportunities so that you get and compete with the schools in a different way. So it's not only about achievement, but it is about learning, and so you get And then to use the last word we use is community learning opportunities, because you also have to fight against the family is the only one responsible for this. And though it doesn't matter what's in the community, it's what your family is willing to provide. So you've got to go and, so you got to enlarge the frame and use it in a very deliberate way to think about these things differently.
Pat, you're the one left with your, was that from before or is that a new one? It's a new one?
So I just, first of all, thank everybody. It's been a very exciting day. And I was absorbing what this panel was saying, and I was trying to think of where are commonalities and connections to abstract out. And I came back to Dale's figure, because I like arrows and boxes. I came back to Dale's figure about the way of evaluating. And what I thought was a shift that maybe prevention should take on, and intervention in general, which is this, it's about evaluating and trying to understand what makes these programs better or makes these efforts stronger and more effective, which I think was also what Jean was trying to talk about, and that's what we're trying to do, as opposed to testing, does this program work or not? Or we can't test this because it's so complicated and it's so multidimensional, we might as well not try to really see if it is a good thing to be funding or subjecting kids to, or putting lots of time and energy into. I think you've got a potential frame there that could be very valuable. So sounds like I don't have the last word.
Well, it's just you gave me the best word. It's the same thing that's going on in education. So you're talking about, evidence-based is the high-stakes environment. Instead of giving teachers skills to improve their performance and feedback, it's getting rid of the bottom 8% or whatever. So it's very much the evidence-based has been, it didn't have to be, is incorporated in the capitalistic mold, and get rid of the bad ones. And that gets everybody to distort what they're doing, to undermine the system. And so it doesn't leave the potential for improvement in the way that both Dale and Jean have done it. See, I'm getting really old. I can't even speak. I need macchiato really bad.